Hello and welcome to Stay for Dinner, a podcast of cooking, curiosity, and conversation. If you love cooking, hate cooking, you have no idea how you even feel about cooking because you have never tried it before, congratulations, you are in the right place. I am DC Pierson. I am your host. I'm a comedian, an author, an enthusiastic home cook, and today I am extra enthusiastic because this is the beginning of a project that I've been wanting to do for a long time, wherein I am going to make ramen on the show. And the reason it's a project is because I'm going to do it over multiple weeks because there's lots of different steps that go into it, and I'm not even sure I'm going to actually make the noodles myself. That's how many steps go into this process. And the first step in that process is this week I'm going to be making Tonkatsu Broth, which is my dream ramen broth. It was kind of my first when I really fell in love with like actual Japanese ramen. It was tonkatsu. I feel like that's the same thing for a lot of people. I even have, I follow this guy on Instagram called Ramen Lord. His name is Mike Satinover. He does like pop-ups of, like ramen pop-ups in Chicago where he lives. And he was lamenting that, it's just become like the standard issue. Everybody's introduction to ramen is like tonkatsu broth, and it's usually, maybe it's spicy, and they never really go beyond that. And I totally get that, totally get where he's coming from, and I have, my love of ramen has made me, want to seek out other, also I don't know if you can hear it, there's water for coffee literally boiling in the background. That's that sound, that's how early it is. And oh, here it goes, it's boiling. Anyway, I have sought out other types of ramen since then, it sort of expanded my horizons, and I have really enjoyed that process. Sometimes if I'm working out of town, especially or definitely in a pre-pandemic world, would always, try to seek out different ramen places and stuff like that. But tonkatsu has my heart, specifically the tonkatsu at Silver Lake Ramen in Silver Lake was sort of my introduction to like, oh man, I've always liked ramen, but this is really good. So this week I am going to be making tonkatsu, which is pork bone broth, even though it has like chicken and other kind of stuff in it as well. It is, it's a process, and I've wanted to do it for a long time, and I finally have a chance. So this week, step one, entry one in the ramen files is this tonkatsu recipe from, I've talked about it before, this book, Let's Make Ramen by Hugh Amano and Sarah Becan. Sarah Becan, you may have heard me shout out before on the show. She did my podcast art, and it's a really cool like comic book cookbook. And I've made some of the more introductory level things from it, but it's been a while that I've been wanting to dive into some of the more project-y stuff, and that's what we're doing here. As Hugh is pictured in a dialogue balloon saying in this recipe, tonkatsu takes commitment. In some ramen-yas, like ramen shops, the pots never stop boiling. And so stick around, check in on it from time to time, and that is exactly what I plan to do. And it's pretty fun. I had to seek out pork trotters, like literally pork feet, which I've used once before, but it's always a little bit of a process trying to find a place that'll sell you pork trotters. Usually like your local down and dirty butcher shop, maybe like where restaurants shop and stuff. We'll have them. So while I'm talking about that, quick check of my ingredients. We have 2 pork trotters, about 5 pounds, 3 pounds of chicken bones or 2 carcasses. I have 1 chicken carcass and one like package of like frozen chicken backs. So I'll be using that for the other one. And 3 pounds of either pork neck bones or pork ribs. I have 3 pounds of ribs, 2 bunches of green onions trimmed and cut in half crosswise, half a pound of fresh ginger unpeeled cut into 1/4-inch slices. Have that. 2 8-inch, 8 by 4-inch sheets of kombu and tare of your choice. Tare is the like basically flavored, super concentrated flavored element that you stir in before serving. I'm actually not going to even make that this week. That's how many stages we're doing this, and that'll come in, but before I assemble the ramen and serve. And now the coffee is ready. What if I just took a sip of it and started talking really loud all of a sudden? That would be great. Quick couple little prep things I need to do. One of them is that my pork ribs are in like a full rack, so I'm going to cut those individually. Mostly just, I think more so like the bones will be more exposed to the cooking process, and then also I think just so they'll fit more snugly in the pot. It's going to be kind of a tight fit. There's a lot of stuff. When you're putting this, it's a really long rack of ribs that I'm just putting into this pot, you really kind of understand, oh, right, that's how it gets super flavorful. And speaking of that, it says you can cook it for 6 to up to 16 hours. That's why I wanted to get an early start on it. We'll see how deep I get into that process, because it's not super passive. You kind of have to refill the water level every hour or so, I guess. So we'll see how deep I get. I definitely want to go at least 12. That's the ribs in. I'm going to throw in these chicken backs. $2.15 for 3. Can't beat that deal. Got this quite a thing of ginger here that I will be breaking up and then slicing up. And then I'm going to trim these green onions, trim the root ends off, and slice them in half. All right, I'm going to throw those in the pot in a second, but first I'm going to do the trotters. Yep, those are pig's feet. And now I'm going to add 2 gallons of water. And it's going to be tight, I think. This is a big pot, but there's a lot of stuff in here. All right, I did not record that part because it was too messy and porky and crazy, but basically what ended up happening is I determined that there was just no way to get 2 gallons of water in the pot in addition to, and it's a pretty big stock pot too. So I ended up making the executive decision to do 2 pots instead, and then had to redistribute the water and all the, each one has a pig's foot each in it, and I think it will, the principle should still hold if they have the same amount of, each one has a gallon of water in it and about the same amount of ingredients, and then I will just be combining them at the end. I think we'll be in good shape. Now I'm going to start each of them on a boil. And I'm to make note of the water level in each, because I'll be refilling it about every hour or so until the last hour. And right now I would say I'm on pace for probably doing a 12-hour cook. Alright, so as they're coming to a boil here, I meant to start skimming if there's any sort of little scummy business that floats to the top. Skim that off and discard it. And yeah, there's plenty of little foamy, kind of grayish, brownish stuff that's floating to the top, and you can also already see the little bubbles of, I assume, fat and collagen that's rising to the top. Not intending to scrape that off. That's what we're here for. It's funny, as soon as I finish one pot, I turn to the other pot, and there's more. But it's all part of the process. All right, I would call us boiling now, so I think my time starts now. All right, I'm about at the hour mark here, and as predicted by the recipe, once I skimmed a lot of the gunk off for the first couple minutes, there hasn't been a ton since, just a little bit. Definitely understand why you have to refill the water every hour. I've had these things on a pretty decent boil ever since the beginning, and with a few adjustments just to keep them from completely boiling over. But especially as the liquid boils off, you can really kind of let them rip, and that's what I'm trying to do. But I see why you have to refill the liquid, because the level gets really low. And in one case, one of them is like a stock pot, and then the other one is kind of a shallower soup pot, or whatever you would call it, almost like Dutch oven shaped. And in that one, the water level towards the end here is getting so low that one of my trotters is uncovered, and I really want it to be as submerged as possible the entire time. So I think what I'm going to do is take it out and cut it like in half, which is going to be a little gnarly, but I think I should be, it's already kind of, this is going to sound gross if you find this kind of thing gross, but it's kind of split in half of its own volition, so I'm going to take it out and see if I can just cut it, or I might have to wait, we'll see, but I'm going to try. And that'll just hopefully let it lay flatter. Not a huge deal, I just want it to be, as getting as much out of it as possible. Sweet, yeah, it cut pretty cleanly right down the center. So that should allow me to let it just lay flatter and be more submerged for more of the time, yield more of its collagen, etc. And I said earlier that we're trying to get the collagen and the fat. I think what we're mostly trying to extract, honestly, is the collagen. We're going to refrigerate it overnight and then use that as a really easy way to skim a lot of the actual just fat off. Oh yeah, that'll be really submerged for most of the cooking time. And I am going to refill each of these back to the water level, and then do it all over again in an hour, and do that probably about 12 times. I'll keep you updated if anything crazy happens, but it should be fairly straightforward. And you can, as I'm refilling the pots, you can already see the liquid starting to get cloudy. That's really one thing that I associate with Tonkatsu broth, is just that really, really cloudy, opaque, kind of pinkish, reddish, beigeish color, and not to that degree yet. Right now it's just kind of like yellow. It looks a little bit more like chicken soup, but we're only an hour in on this thing. So I will talk to you again maybe in an hour, maybe in 6 hours, maybe in 12 hours. We will see. All right, coming at you almost, 12 hours after this initially started boiling. I've gone from just drinking a cup of coffee to having had a glass of wine, and we are ready to do the second to last step. I don't know if you can hear, but these are still kind of bubbling away in the last hour. I followed directions and didn't add any water so that they were able to cook down even more. And over the process of the day, the broth has just been getting more and more opaque. I've been adding water every hour, like I said, except for that last hour. And it looks so, it has that opaque, milky, to it, and it looks fantastic. I'm almost worried that I cooked it down too much at the end, but I know I'll probably combine them here into one pot and then do my next step, which is stirring in a couple of sheets of kombu and then just letting it sit and cool for an hour. And I think the combination of the two it's still gonna be a pretty formidable amount of liquid, I think. And then I'll be able to store it and strain it and strain the fat off tomorrow morning. And then I'll have my tonkatsu broth. I'm super excited about that. And then I will be using the fat for the next part of this project. So that'll be exciting too. So let me get this going here. Combining one pot into the other one as delicately as possible. And I should say I'm trying to not let these solids from one pot fall into the other one. I really don't need them anymore. Everything is looking pretty darn, cooked out, and the liquid that's coming out, the liquid that's left is just super rich looking, for lack of a better term. It's just very, it smells really good. It smells very like tonkatsu, and you can already see it's starting to cool right now, and it's already like congealing on the top. It just looks super, super, super rich. I'm gonna go grab the kombu and stir that in. I ended up using a few more sheets than I thought I would at the beginning, because these are smaller than anticipated by the recipe. The recipe said about 8" by 4", but it did say about an ounce of kombu, so I measured on a scale actually, and then have put them in the broth, and I'm gonna let that sit for about an hour, let those infuse, and then once it's about at room temperature, we'll strain it a couple times and then put it in the fridge. All right, here we go. We started this process at a little after 8 a.m. and it is now 11:30 at night, and I'm about to do the final steps, at least for tonight, which is to strain the broth into, strain it with a larger mesh strainer and then strain it with a fine mesh strainer. I'm worried that I cooked it down a little more than I wanted to on the last round, but that's fine. I think I can always dilute it with water, but I'm gonna go ahead and start straining it and see how much I yield. All right, here we go, straining the first round. And now we're gonna go through the fine mesh strainer. All right, so I just finished passing through the fine mesh strainer, and I think said I was ultimately supposed to yield 4 quarts. I yielded closer to a little less than 1.5 quarts, and I think that's just because I didn't add any water for I added a little bit of water right before the last hour, but it was already pretty low, and I had it on pretty high for the last hour, so I think quite a bit cooked off. But again, I should just be able to dilute it with more water to get more, to get closer to that 4 quarts. But I should be looking at about, right now, just as it is, I think by my calculations, about maybe 3 to 4 bowls of ramen. But I want to, for all the effort, I want to get closer to that 4 quart mark. And as I've poured them into some plastic deli containers to put in the fridge overnight, and I can already see the fat starting to separate in one, and the rest of it looks so thick and rich and great. I'm really excited about that. And I do the segue every time, and I always mean it, but I really enjoyed this conversation that you're about to hear with Matt Pais. Matt was a film critic for the Chicago Tribune's Red Eye for many years. He wrote a book all about Saved by the Bell called Zach Morris Lied 326 times. I think that's the number. Hold on, let me look. 329 times. Okay, I'm glad I checked. I did not want to Zach Morris of myself make there. I really enjoyed this conversation. As you'll hear, I was not a big Saved by the Bell fan growing up. I never really watched it for whatever reason, and I always felt like out of the loop, and so I used this conversation, if nothing else, for Matt to catch me up, explain the phenomenon. We talked about food in Saved by the Bell. In case you're wondering what the connection is, that's what the connection is. And also the connection is just me as a human being genuinely curious, like, why do people care so much about this thing that everybody also kind of agrees is just like silly and whatever? And I think we got into some deep Saved by the Bell symbology, and we understand now, I think, maybe hopefully why, or I understand a little more why it resonates. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. Check it out. Matt Pais. Matt Pais, thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, this is, we're recording remotely, so we're not able to actually share a meal. And so all I can do is hope that whatever you ate last was both delicious and satisfying.
Thank you so much for having me, DC. I'm so glad to be here.
We have to own right up at the top, as we discussed beforehand, this is not just going to be, a normal conversation, which is where I normally say, it's about food and cooking and everything food and cooking are related to, which is everything. So I guess we're going to touch on everything. So that kind of still applies. But I come here today with a quest in mind, or maybe, just on some sort of like redemption arc. And that is, you are currently promoting a book that you have written called Zach Morris Lied 329 Times about Saved by the Bell. You're like the Nate Silver of the 90s adolescent and teen sitcom Saved by the Bell. You've like run the numbers on the show, and you've produced this book. And so I'm looking to you to just sort of like fill in a gap in my knowledge, or explain to me the Saved by the Bell phenomenon, because as we discussed before we set this interview, I did not watch Saved by the Bell growing up. And it didn't really seem like anything at the time. But then as I went to high school and then college and then post-college in my 20s and in sort of like bar conversations and parties and things, the fact that I did not watch Saved by the Bell created such a cultural knowledge gap that I just had to kind of like fake my way through, or be like, oh, I didn't really watch it. And when people were like, why? I didn't really have a good answer, because I did watch Saturday morning cartoons, and like a lot of sort of like preteens or even preteens of that age, I did aspire to be a teenager. And that seems to me like when a lot of people first watched and fell in love with Saved by the Bell. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm asking, besides just, please catch me up on the entirety of Saved by the Bell in 45 minutes or whatever. It's not really what I'm asking. I guess just what I want to know is, like, deep down, what is the Saved by the Bell mystique? Like, beyond just the sort of facts and figures and the references that I can now kind of like parrot back, even though I never actually watched an episode of the show. Like, I'm so excited, I'm so scared, that I just picked up by proxy. What is the Saved by the Bell mystique? Like, what made you want to write a book about it? What draws people back to it? What does it mean? What does Saved by the Bell mean for those who love it?
I think that's such a great question, because this is something that hasn't had a new episode in more than 25 years, setting aside the new class, of course. And yet it's something that I feel like people are still having conversations about it online on a daily basis. It's about to come back, be rebooted on Peacock. It's this cultural phenomenon that has had unbelievable ongoing relevance, where it's mentioned on Brooklyn Nine-Nine or a John Mulaney special, and it just has this sort of permanent cachet. And I don't think it's not an easy answer to necessarily explain why. Part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, in which I rewatched the entire series, counted Zach's lies in every episode, and reassessed everything with some new modern adult eyes, was to track it from season to season, look at, was he becoming more dishonest as he got older, less dishonest, which relationships were drawing the best behavior out of him, how did that impact his relationships with women, how was the show treating Jesse, which often it was progressively negative as time went on. But a lot of what I was trying to understand was to cross-reference how beloved this show and even the characters still are for so many people, while we simultaneously seem to recognize, especially with the massive fandom for the Zach Morris's Trash series, that this main character was a horrible person, and not even like a lovable anti-hero. He was actively cruel to the closest people in his life almost every week. And that is just a weird thing to have to reconcile together. So I wondered if by putting some statistics to this show and celebrating it while also trying to push my understanding of it to a new level with numbers, would I see things differently? And I really think that I did.
So this is the level of like I can picture, when you say Zach Morris, like I can picture him in my head. I know he had a big phone, like that used to be a sort of like when kids first started to have cell phones, and then enough people had enough cell phones that you could be said to have like an old cell phone. People would make fun of you for having like the Zach Morris phone if it was like all big, you know, when cell phones were getting progressively smaller and smaller. And then now we know that they've since like sort of gone the other direction. And I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but he can like freeze time and talk to the audience, right? Like he has sort of Ferris Bueller powers. Is that accurate? Or am I thinking of Small Wonder?
You know, you are right on. He is able to call a timeout where everything freezes, and Ferris Bueller is a name that came up a few times when I was putting the book together, because I interviewed 22 cast members from the show.
Wow.
I talked to the co-founder of the Saved by the Max pop-up restaurant that was incredibly popular in Chicago and LA, as well as Dashiell Driscoll, who is the founder, the creator of Zach Morris's Trash, and is now hosting the Zach to the Future podcast with Mark Paul Gosselaar, Zach Morris himself, who is now watching the show for the first time ever, because he's kind of on the outside of it at this point, doesn't really remember much, doesn't know much, so they're experiencing it.
Wow.
For Mark Paul for the first time, and it was an absolute blast to get to talk to those guys a few weeks back about the book and dive into the episode Beauty and the Screech.
So what does the fact that I guess what you're telling me is, and this is sort of this is kind of the thesis statement of the book and of a lot of Saved by the Bell scholarship, shall we say, is centered around the fact that Zach Morris is the central character on the show. He's kind of our sort of like way in. He's the audience, almost the audience surrogate, I guess it sounds like, even though he's cool, right? Is he cool?
That is a perfect question, because that is something that really shifted, I think, in returning it to the show in this context. In fact, when I interviewed Dashiell for the book, he and I were talking about that when we watched this show as kids, we absolutely thought Zach was cool. He is for sure the main character of the series. The plots often revolve around him, and I think most people who watch the show when they were younger thought he was cool, but to look at it years later, he often seems desperate, in over his head, afraid, and really flailing. And I don't think that the intention of the show was to, if they were intending to teach us a lesson about sort of the futility of that experience, it arguably did not work, because this happened in every episode. They tried not to have any continuity, because the nature of sitcom television at that time, you wanted the shows to be able to run whenever and not have people feel lost if they hadn't seen the last one. But as a result, the impact was, he usually didn't get away with it, but there were really never any lasting consequences. So the nostalgia for the show is really, really powerful, clearly, but you wind up assessing it as something about, wow, his friends really were quite forgiving, that week in and week out, he was doing the worst possible thing. It seemed like they didn't predict that he would do it, but then eventually said, okay, we know how to handle this. And then by the end, Zach looks pretty foolish. He didn't get away with it, but he also didn't learn enough to not go through the exact same thing the following week.
So, and again, I'm not a Saved by the Bell scholar. I am merely a sort of cultural, observer, as are we all, and a member of the sort of the generational cohort that I feel like was the target audience for Zach Morris. And what I'm hearing, and you tell me if I'm off base here, is that an entire generation of people were of television, viewers, were watching a show centered around a guy who, when you first meet him, like seems really cool, and it's like, wow, he's got it all, and this is really great. But then you revisit it years later and you realize that what he claims to be is actually kind of like threadbare and desperate, and that he's not cool. He's actually just like constantly lying and manipulating people. And while he never fully and completely triumphs, he also never fully faces consequences and just continues to lie and lie pathologically. I guess what I'm trying to say or ask you is, do you think that on a subconscious level, Zach Morris laid the groundwork for a Trump presidency?
That line of questioning was set up incredibly well, DC. I think put it this way. As I started putting the book together, I had to make sure I wasn't recognizing those parallels too much. Because, I mean, there's an episode called The Election, which of course I had seen previously, but upon returning to it and seeing how Jessie, the dedicated, intelligent female candidate for school president, is the favorite to win class president and really cares and wants to take care of people, and Zach only gets involved in the race for president because he wants to win a free trip, and he winds up swapping the ballots and doing all these nefarious things in order to undermine democracy and win the presidency. And obviously that didn't spark memories of anything. So and there are a number of episodes where clearly, I mean, we have to recognize that it's been a long time since the late 80s, early 90s. Times have changed a lot. There are things that were being done in comedy, both in movies, on TV, jokes about people looking through peepholes, to name one of many. Things that were somehow deemed okay then that are not okay. The purpose of the book is not to act as if I don't realize times have changed for the better, which they have, and that's good. But it's hard not to watch some of the episodes back and feel that Zach is being a predator, being insensitive to women at every possible turn. Even, and this is, I guess, compared to some other things, this is not even arguably as bad as some of the other things he does. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that the show, so much of the arc of the show is about Zach and Kelly's relationship, just like Ross and Rachel or Ted and Robin or any type of will they, won't they central couple for a sitcom. And for the entire run of the show, which ends with them getting married for a TV movie Wedding in Las Vegas, he doesn't say anything about her other than how happy he is that she's the best looking girl in school, or she's so pretty. It's just always about her appearance. And this was a Saturday morning show. I don't think they were trying to make any grand statements about intimacy or relationships. However, I'm sure we can all think. Obviously, you didn't watch Saved by the Bell, but I have to imagine anyone can think of a show that they watched when they were younger and unintentionally absorbed a lesson or a message that they were putting out there, and in the way that it either impacted their view of an ideal relationship or just like a special episode that they had that when you were younger, like in Saved by the Bell, there's an episode about drinking and driving where they have one beer and the next morning they're all feeling horrible. And for a couple of years after I saw that episode when I was much younger, I was like, wow, one beer and you feel that badly, because the tone of episodes of that era was trying to send that message. If you have one sip, you will never stand up again. And that's, I mean, when you think of shows you watched when you were younger, do you remember anything having that type of impact on you?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was the one kid where it was like, I think they ended up discovering that the DARE program made kids more likely to try drugs because they were just like, these drugs are so crazy and this is how they make you feel, and they were just so like trying so desperately hard to like demonize them that they just ended up, imbuing them with all of this, like all of the rebellious coolness that drugs seemingly already have if you're prohibiting them in any way and telling kids like, never do this, they're too fun. I was like the one kid, I think I was like the textbook example of why the DARE program didn't work, not because it made drugs sound more cool to me, but because it made me terrified of drugs. But I was clearly the one kid who, like, I didn't need that messaging. Like, you didn't need to try to tell me that drugs were bad. Mm-hmm. I already thought they were bad. In no small part, I think, thanks to a lot of what you're describing. Like, there was I feel like it was on TV, but then it was also a like free like VHS or something. I think your parents could like send away for, or maybe they were giving it out at McDonald's or something, where I think it was called like Cartoon All-Stars or something against drugs or something like that. And it was basically all cartoons at the time were sort of banding together across, I think, any amount of like IP or studio walled, gardens, and we're getting together to say like drugs are bad. And of course, I don't think they even mentioned like specifically marijuana or cocaine. It was just capital D drugs. And there was like a cartoon, every kid, every teen protagonist who I think maybe tried, I don't know, just genera drugs, like pills in a bag. And then suddenly he was on like a really scary roller coaster. And I just remember being like, nope, I don't even like normal roller coasters, I'm pretty sure, for the most part. So I fully bought all of that, completely hook, line, and sinker. But again, I think if that messaging is going to work that well on you, you almost don't even need the messaging to begin with. It's not to deny that messaging isn't powerful, particularly when aimed at children and repeated. But do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think you hit on a couple of things. One is that I think you could argue that part of the reason why Saved by the Bell had such an impact at the time and has stuck with people so much is because it was this fun live action thing for people on Saturday mornings, that it wasn't a cartoon. It was something where a lot of 10 to 12-year-olds could look up and see high school kids that they could probably admire or want to learn from or think about being older. And of course, we're talking about these message-related episodes, but the vast majority of Saved by the Bell episodes did not try to pass along a message like this. A lot of it was just ridiculous and trying to be fun and not trying to be like a movie of the week type thing. I mean, every other week there was a dance. Every other week there was a new girl in school, and there was just by not having to have any continuity, by the characters seemingly not remembering their own lives. I swear there's a sequence of 3 episodes where it's like Kelly cannot sing, Kelly's a great singer, and then Kelly cannot sing again. And it was just sort of it's remarkable to think of. Let's phrase it as the creative freedom that one must have when writing something, and you're not beholden to the definitions of any of the people from week to week. Certainly, there are behaviors that were the same throughout the series, but sitcom TV has changed so much since then that I'm really interested to see how the reboot handles the characters and the ways in which it sort of does feel like Saved by the Bell, but the ways in which it might. I don't know if you've seen the trailer for the reboot, but Tracy Wigfield of 30 Rock is behind it, and the trailers and the footage they've shown so far definitely has as much of a 30 Rock vibe as it does Saved by the Bell vibe. So that's an interesting combination, but I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I think like you have with something like Saved by the Bell, it's like people who liked it. I feel like it almost seems like, or maybe it seems like it was for you. I wonder if this wasn't the case for like Tracy Wigfield as well and other sort of like smart, culturally aware people, that it's almost like if when you first start watching it, I would imagine it's like maybe you're a kid and you're genuinely just like, these people are cool and it's funny and it makes me think of like what it's going to be like to be a teenager, even though of course it's going to be nothing like this, this show ultimately when you get there. But like when you first start to maybe watch it enough to realize, wait a minute, Kelly was a bad singer last week and this week she's good. That doesn't make sense or whatever. Like it's almost your introduction to like a meta level on top of entertainment or something where you can be going like, I'm enjoying this, but maybe the way in which I'm meant to enjoy it and the way in which I'm actually enjoying it are starting to diverge a little bit. And that can almost be a kind of like germ for the way that I don't even want to say I like irony or ironic enjoyment makes it sound bad or like less than it is. I think that has like a pejorative context, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, maybe this was a lot of people's first experience with liking something, but almost feeling like I'm liking it in like a little bit of a self-aware way, or I'm having, does that make sense? So I guess all that to say, it doesn't surprise me that when it's being rebooted, it's not just in deadly earnest, super, a bunch of just like middle-aged and older men who wish they weren't writing this teen sitcom are like, yeah, here you go, kids, and just shoveling it, by the pound. But it's actually like people writing it going like, this is funny and self-aware and for people who enjoyed the show the first time around, but can also probably, I'm assuming, be enjoyed by like their kids that are maybe the age now that they were when they first watched the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of touches on a little bit of the catch-22 of Saved by the Bell, or maybe paradox would be a better word there, but the notion that I think so many people love it, but I don't know how many people like it. But in returning to the series, I have to reiterate that this book is absolutely a celebration of the show, despite identifying how many times Zach lied and how many things maybe don't hold up. There's still a lot of things that do hold up, and awareness that just as the troubling moments come more into focus, so do the better ones. I mean, in no way would anyone have thought that the little 6-episode mini season that they did at the Malibu Sands Beach Club, no one would have thought that Stacey Carosi, played by Leah Remini, would then have replaced Kelly as the female lead with Zach, essentially. But to look at the show based on how many times Zach is lying, who he's lying to, and what he's like as a person in different relationships, it was really kind of startling to do this all at once and see, wow, with Kelly, he's always uncomfortable, he's always dishonest, he never, or extremely rarely, does he match up with her in a way that they seem to actually fit. And of course, that would be the time when people would say like, well, of course, That might be the case for many high school relationships or many college relationships, but that's fine. But the show did bring them back together 10 times and have them get married for questionable reasons. And to look at the show again and see the different parts of Zach's personality that a couple other romantic interests brought out of him, it is, and you could say this about a lot of other sitcoms too, it is fascinating to consider what might have happened if the writers didn't feel like they had to go a particular direction. I know that it's the Rachel Joey storyline on Friends seems to be extremely unpopular. I think most fans didn't like it. I feel like I've read that the cast didn't particularly like it. I think it's at least thought-provoking because of the different rhythm that they had with each other compared to Rachel with Ross. And it doesn't mean I think that Rachel should have ended up with Joey, but occasionally sitcoms give us these little glimpses, and maybe it's just the fact of like, yeah, a lot of people could spend a short time together, but if they spent a longer time together, it doesn't go as well. So maybe it's misleading to say that just because there are a couple episodes of good rapport between two characters means they should have been together forever. But I find it thought-provoking to think about the other directions that shows could have taken if they had the chance.
And it's almost like what you're describing is like wanting or the show is almost, it's like you have these like sitcom characters that are, especially in the sort of older style, network sitcom. And it sounds like extremely in the case of Saved by the Bell, which is like truly for kids. There's not even like a season arc really that they're sort of going through. It's like really just like it's like Edge of Tomorrow or Groundhog Day or something. It's like we're really, for the most part, like going back to truly zero at the beginning of every episode. It's like what you're describing is almost the moments where they chafe against or at least tease like actual change, characters like discovering new relationships and going in different directions rather than just returning to that same Hot Wheels track. Which I understand liking. I mean, again, it almost sounds like, I hear you say that and I imagine you being a kid watching the show, and it almost sounds like you're like, yes, I enjoy the part of it that repeats. Of course, that's what like brings us back to a show, especially as a kid. You just like seeing, okay, it played out again. The cartoon, it happened exactly the same way. Pinky and the Brain tried to take over the world and then they didn't. And that's satisfying, but there's almost some part of you as a kid that is like imagining like, whoa, what if this changed, like what if it was different? That almost feels like the seed of, I guess what I'm trying to say basically between like you talking about or us talking about like how the people making the new Saved by the Bell, it's kind of like funny and witty and sort of 30 Rock-ish, or seems like it's going in that direction, somewhat self-aware, or like what I'm describing right now, and you sort of seeing those alternate realities, within the show that mostly just repeats itself. It almost is like, in a weird way, it feels like the same thing as like having a really lo-fi video game when you were a kid, where your imagination was kind of called upon to fill in more of the stuff versus now. And I don't even know that this is true, and it feels reductive to say this, but like having a super immersive PS5 game where everything is like photo real, maybe there's not as much space for your brain to fill in. And I guess what I'm trying to say is like maybe Saved by the Bell in its kind of inherent paper thin, this is just a thing that we're shoveling into kids' brains by the pound to like make a thing that we can intersperse with Sunny Delight commercials. That's kind of a beautiful thing because it allows the thinness of it, allows young minds to kind of like fill it in with like what might be like that it may be a more immersive, even I would say like better show, like doesn't leave as much room for your imagination to play around in because it's like it's doing more of the work for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a smart observation, and it could even that could go two ways that are both potentially advantageous for the show, because it either creates that imagination that you're describing, or it gets the viewer on its wavelength and therefore doesn't doesn't really ask you to create anything more. I don't think people watched for example, the episode where Zach and Lisa, a dynamic changes in their friendship and they think they might want to be together, which causes a love triangle with Screech, who has always been in love with Lisa. And by the end, spoiler alert, I guess, for anyone who hasn't seen this one. And by the end of that episode, there's a chance that Zach and Lisa have found something together, but that was never followed up on for more than an episode. And the guest characters would come in and there'd be seemingly great relationships brewing, and then we would never see them again. And of course, that's the nature of sitcoms. But also, like, as a kid watching, I didn't ask myself, wait a minute, I thought last week Zach and Lisa were going into a new direction in their relationship. No, things didn't. I mean, the perfect example, the pilot of the show aired as the second to last episode of the first high school season. So in putting together the book and returning to the series and writing about it chronologically, once Slater and Kelly and Jesse are introduced for high school, several of the first handful of episodes make no sense without the context of the pilot, but no one cared, and it's silly to complain. It's just a fun show. But if you look closely, you have to recognize, like, both what it is and what it isn't.
What did it, the first time watching it, like, what did it mean to you? Like, what do you remember? Why did you like it? Did you have like rituals around it? Did you not miss an episode? Did you catch it every so often? Like, what did it mean to you when it was like first on, like the experience of you actually watching it?
You know, it's on some level, it's hard sometimes with memories. You know, you almost feel like you're inventing it from what you think you remember, of course. So because it was so long ago, I feel like certain TV shows can feel like comfort food probably at times. So whether it was knowing that it was going to be on Saturday morning or watching it when you came home from school, because clearly for the last 30 years, Saved by the Bell has just been on all the time, no matter what. So you could watch it Saturday morning, you could watch it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's just been syndicated and available. And I think what you touched on before, of it's such a powerful thing as a kid to look at someone who is 3 to 5 years older than you and feel like they have lived so much more, they have it figured out, they're dealing with things that it's going to be decades before you ever experience. And I think that's probably part of what the enjoyment was for me and a lot of people, is being able to just fast forward a little bit, to not have any concept of this is not reality. It doesn't mean you thought it was reality, but it was just it was really well cast. The ensemble had great chemistry with each other. No matter how badly the behavior was, they kept you coming back for more because of these hijinks that somehow felt innocent, at least to the target demographic. I mean, or maybe in retrospect, it was just the quantity of MC Hammers, of MC Hammer references and Kevin Costner references, bizarrely, since he was like 20 years older than the characters at the time. A lot of Gorbachev references, actually.
Huh. In what context?
Just some random political allusions. I mean, they mentioned Dan Quayle a couple times. It's not, I wouldn't say it's particularly meant to make any sort of point. It's just the show had an interesting approach to pop culture and famous people, where occasionally they would mention something like, I guess you could say MC Hammer was a timely reference at that time. Although after mentioning him in almost every other episode for a while, that maybe was a little much. But then there were also a lot of Elvis references and things that just felt totally spinning a pop cultural wheel and not even necessarily trying to like plant their feet about any particular fandom. but so much. But again, I think it's to me it's compelling the way that I think people are very protective about nostalgic properties. No one wants to go back to a movie that they loved as a kid and have to say, "Oh, this is terrible. I don't like this now, and it ruins my memory of it as a kid." I totally get that no one wants to do that, and I am absolutely not doing that with Saved by the Bell by any means. I think, to me, what I think is important and extremely possible, I would hope, is to be able to feel two things about something at the same time. Like, I love this at the time. I still see what it meant to me then and what I like about it now, but that doesn't mean it has to exist in this twinkly case where if I dare poke it, everything will shatter, disintegrate, and my relationship with it and my memories of it and all the sensitive feelings of the time will then just be ruined. Do you think people generally prefer not even to take that approach? You think it's sort of just like, you know what, leave my childhood alone. It is what it is, and I would prefer not to like have that conversation about it.
I don't know. That's a good question. I would think in general, it feels very, I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. And I think it's different for different people. And I think it depends on how much they still define themselves by what they like or what the sort. It's such a, that I think what you're hinting at is such a really deep question, because I think we see different fandoms react in different ways. Or I think of like, the sort of, for lack of a better term, like Gen X kind of pop cultural way of looking at things, where it was like in the 90s, you suddenly had a wave of characters in movies and TV shows talking about movies and TV shows, from like the 70s or something, the things that the people making these things grew up on. And almost kind of, like you said, thinking two different things about them, like on some level, probably knowing like, yeah, I can't even think of a good example. The banana splits is like dumb. But then it's kind of fun to overanalyze it and to put more thought into it than maybe I did as a kid. I think that's a very, the sort of like kind of ironic postmodern dissection of these things is, I think that is kind of fun, or it can be a way to show off that you're like, I don't know, that you're witty, or it can just be something to talk about at a party. I mean, I think that's so many of these Saved by the Bell related conversations that I witnessed and felt like I couldn't really be a part of, or might have to like slink away from, had to do with people being like, wow, now that we're in college and we're talking about Saved by the Bell, I'm realizing that exactly what you're saying. Like basically that like Zach Morris is like, a sociopath or whatever, like in that is kind of like fun, but it doesn't necessarily devalue anything about or take anything away from that you initially liked it and it gave you a different feeling. And then I do think now, I think you do sort of sometimes have people reacting to that kind of thing, especially I think if there are properties that skew a little more, I would say like quote unquote nerd, sort of like Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever, where we have often or comic book type stuff where you see people, even like grown-ups, reacting in a way where it's like, if you're trying to dissect this or rethink this or maybe reinvent this in any way at all, and then this goes into so much like political stuff and misogyny and racism and all these different things, if you're trying to apply any amount of critical thought to this thing, you are, like you said, like destroying my childhood, or why are you trying to make it woke, or why are you whatever, that I think is like really usually, I guess, like toxic, for lack of a better term, like people being so defensive of like any amount of like critical reevaluation of the thing. I think there's like I think what you're describing is like the middle ground between just going like this completely reevaluating this thing or viewing this thing as a grown up has somehow like completely ruined this thing for me, and I never want to see it again. and then on the other side, literally being like, don't look at this thing. No one can reevaluate it or criticize it because I'm 40 years old, but it's still like so important to me. And anyone that criticizes it or thinks about it differently, or maybe is going to reinvent it or whatever, needs to be like doxed. You know, I think what you're describing is like the rational, normal adult middle point between those two extremes to me.
Absolutely. And you're right that it's not surprising that when people have such a strong fandom for something that they consider it part of their identity, of course that is going to feel like an attack on who they are if people are picking away at something that they love. But there can also be levels to that. You can still love Saved by the Bell, but if the moment when Slater holds up his fist to Jesse to like jokingly threaten to hit her, if you are laughing at that and happy that there's a laugh track in that moment and that like it's not being evaluated in any way, then that's where I think the problem comes in. It's nothing in the world is I mean, this is the ironic statement of everything of all time to say nothing is all or nothing, but it really isn't. You can love even, and it makes me think of this. You know, when I spent 11 years as the movie critic for the Chicago Tribune's Red Eye, sometimes I was so determined to be stingy with a 4-star review that there were times where if there was like one moment that I loved a movie but then there was like a line I really didn't like or something that kind of made me cringe, I was like, I don't know, can I still give it 4 stars? Maybe I need to knock it down to 3.5 because I didn't absolutely love every single thing. But that's a really, really, really high bar to clear. And it's worth considering if that might be taking it a little bit too far. And I just mentioned that in the sense of I wonder if when people go back to properties, if they're feeling like because it means so much to them, because they consider that part of their growing up, part of their identity, that to poke even one hole would make them uncomfortable. I've rewatched Mighty Ducks during this pandemic. I still found it enjoyable. I rewatched a lot of Boy Meets World and found that a lot of that was even better than I remembered, and some of it was worse. And I'm okay with that. But maybe I understand I guess it must be a case by case basis if people are willing to take it there or not.
How do you think the people who made Saved by the Bell felt about it at the time? Like, obviously, I mean, it seems like from what you're describing, like most of the cast is kind of enjoying that people are still talking about it and enjoying with it and engaging with it. It sounds like, but how do you think, like, I just imagine, and maybe this is honestly almost like a stereotype that I'm bringing to it. I imagine grownups viewing children's entertainment at the time is somehow less than. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think thankfully now, you know, people who I think like grew up with good children's entertainment or maybe grew up with bad children's entertainment and are making entertainment now, like value and venerate it in a different way, or at least a lot of them do. And I think that's awesome. But I think of it at the time, I imagine like the late 80s, early 90s. And I just imagine a sort of like ghettoization of this type of entertainment. And I just can't imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, the people making it being anything other than like sitcom writers who are maybe writing for like adult sitcoms in the 70s and 80s. And now maybe they're getting a little older and they don't feel as whatever. And so they're, you know, creating a show. I don't know. That's like a stereotype that I have in my head. What is the reality? Do you think like, why was the show made? Did the people making it on the sort of like creative and writing side like it? How do they feel about it now? How does that make you feel about it?
Sure. I think it's probably both. I think there was a lot of passion put into the show. Clearly, I think at least sometimes there were there was a goal of passing along a message and trying to help kids deal with things. But the show did have a feeling of non-reality a lot of the time. So I don't. There were plenty of episodes that didn't feel like they were trying to help viewers understand how to think about their relationships, their friendships, their interactions with their families. Like, and that's something that, going back to a show like Boy Meets World, I just felt so aware of how differently that show approached growing up compared to Saved by the Bell. But when I interviewed everyone that I spoke with for the book, many of the people who just had one episode characters talked about, they assumed no one was going to see their episode. They were sort of cast on a whim. It was, the Saturday morning kids show. They really had no expectation that anyone would see it, and can't believe that people are still talking about it. But they're grateful for it too. It seems like the main cast thought they were going to be canceled every year, and really were just sort of diving in and became recognizable, became stars. Obviously, each of those people had very different trajectories after the show ended, but certainly it's fascinating to think about what might have been discussed as the show was being written or made, and how people felt about it. I was reminded of, because you mentioned the college years, or like a college viewpoint. When the college years was originally on, the one season that NBC decided to try Saved by the Bell in prime time, I liked it. I thought it was fun. I believe I was in high school at the time when that was on. Watching it now, it is in competition for the worst season of the show easily.
Wow.
Zach's behavior, while already very troubling in the rest of the series, is just appallingly bad in the college years. And it's not entirely dissimilar to when doing a Dumb and Dumber sequel 20 years later. It doesn't feel the same when the people are going through the same things. You want them to be able to grow up, and it starts to feel uncomfortable. And even just a year or two later, in Saved by the Bell, college years, the treatment of other people and the dishonesty and the shenanigans just doesn't go down the same way. There are a couple good episodes there, but in general, it's interesting, and it's okay, at least from my end, to feel like, wow, this really worked for me at the time because I didn't know any better, and now I do, and I can still laugh here and there, and I can want to have a conversation that I think is stimulating about why all of this actually maybe wasn't good. But sometimes better conversations can be had about things that are kind of bad to okay to kind of good, as opposed to like the best stuff and the worst stuff might not drive a great conversation.
Totally. No, I think you're completely right in that. It sounds like the fact that Saved by the Bell was this perfect mix of like, nobody was really thinking this was like high culture or anything at the time, kind of makes it the perfect thing for people to still be chewing over. And I just think it's neat that, no matter what people's intention was making it, whether they thought people would still be chewing it over, rediscovering it, rebooting it, whatever, the fact that they are doing that is really cool. I think there's like an inherent almost like nobility in that, or a neatness in that, or just something in life where it's like, you can never know what you might do or work on or whatever. It's like a little bit of a butterfly effect thing. You can never know what impact that will have down the line, And I think that's really neat and kind of hopeful in a sense. So I would love to know, we talked about it a little bit in our sort of pre-interview back and forth, but I was like, yeah, it's like a food show. So like, what does Saved by the Bell have to do with food? And you provided me with you came back with, again, you've done your research. Saved by the Bell and food. Give me what is the overview? What role does food play in the world of Saved by the Bell?
Absolutely. Well, I loved thinking about the show this way. It was so fun to break it down. Food, I wouldn't say it would be funny. I wish, I wonder what you would have thought if I was like, oh yeah, the show pretty much revolves around food every episode, in and out. You're making something, it's all about the dish. And then you watch
The bell is the dinner bell.
So that might have been pushing it, but there are a few, there's one episode where Screech becomes a phenomenon within the school because he launches a spaghetti sauce company that everyone is then on board with helping him make spaghetti sauce until they find out that it was based on what they say I don't know if they couldn't say Betty Crocker on the show, but they say it was actually the recipe comes from Betsy Crocker, which I know I keep
lazily like, how are the lawyers like, yeah, that's enough. The lawyers that were like, Betty Crocker, you can't say that. Like, Betsy Crocker. Cool. Yep. We won't get sued.
Clearly the law is just complex in ways we can never understand.
Truly.
And of course, I know I've mentioned Friends a couple times, but then, of course, there was the episode where Phoebe claims to have a brilliant cookie recipe that turns out to come from her grandma's friend Nestle Toulouse. So just the things that, I do not claim to be a scholar of TV in general. It's perhaps just as that Friends episode is reminiscent of Saved by the Bell, maybe that Saved by the Bell episode is reminiscent of something else. But from where I was coming from, it was funny to see things that I didn't really realize had been copied a few years down the line. There are a few episodes in which cooking and baking come into play where it seems like they're going to try to examine sexism and they really just wind up promoting it. So that's less than great.
How so?
Well, the idea that it seems like Slater finds out that he's a great baker and you think, oh, maybe they'll embrace this. But then his quiche blows up and he realizes he doesn't care. And then when the idea of him cooking comes up later on, it's as if the previous episode never happened. There are multiple times where female characters are meant to look stupid because of how they fail in the kitchen. It's just, again, this was a different time, but these are moments that, looking back on it, we can recognize and be happy how perceptions have changed, and also see that like a moment when Zach is making gingerbread women and Slater mentions gingerbread chicks just so Jesse can say, for you, they should have made gingerbread pigs. It's like, on the one hand, the show tried to have a feminist voice in Jesse, except more often than not, when she would call out something that Slater was saying, there would be a comeback that one of the guys would have and a laugh track, and then the suggestion that Jesse was just sort of on a high horse as opposed to being in the right, which that's a tough balance. I'm sure the show never wanted to feel like it was wagging its finger, but at the same time, it wound up enabling a lot of commentary and perspectives that I hope people can recognize as being at worst misogynistic, at best, I guess, just uninformed. But at this, clearly we're at the point in the world where we should take seriously how young men are being raised and not allow that type, not consider just a little token teenage misogyny as being par for the course. Like that's a good thing to be able to recognize as a problem.
Right. No, totally. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think about how often growing up, like, just very interestingly, how like that archetype was often presented as the sort of like, oh, there's a character who's like kind of into feminism and you're sort of meant to be like, okay, the show's kind of saying like, yeah, she's probably right, but then this guy is funny. and he's going to be like, well, you're being really annoying. And then that's kind of, even though the show isn't fully saying like she's wrong, it's like undercutting that point of view in kind of a negative way. Yeah, it's interesting how I guess not too surprising, unfortunately, but interesting how kind of like pervasive that kind of like set piece or that trope was. But I do think on just a like pure story mechanics level, I can understand why you would go to cooking or baking for just kind of like silly mix 'em up stories, which it seems like from what you're describing, the show, mostly consists of, because there's like automatic stakes, or there's sort of just like a person's going to do a thing that they're not used to doing. Oh no, they screwed up. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of good for that. I think oftentimes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And there's an episode where there's a battle of the sexes to determine what a large sum of money is going to be used for. And you're right. There's a visual ease to a cooking competition, and allowing Zach to secretly replace an oven knob and destroy what the girls are making. And yeah, the setting a scene in a kitchen can be dramatic, it can be funny, and arguably part of maybe why Saved by the Bell has endured also is that it seems like they weren't particularly bothered with trying to refine these delicate messages that we're aware of now and can advance the conversation about while still enjoying the material. It was mostly just, as with so many sitcoms, the characters had their lanes, and that was used as the setup for a joke. And people didn't necessarily have to think about it that critically. A lot of times when I was interviewing people for the book, they were able to reflect on their fond memories about making the show and how nice everyone involved in it was, while also simultaneously saying, I don't think anyone took it that seriously at the time in terms of what it was saying. I never told my kids, you can't watch this because of what a terrible guy he is. But I'm also not surprised to hear you doing this type of examination, and it's worth questioning if it's fair to at least put some assessment of toxic masculinity, white male privilege, discussion of the show, when in reality, if you were to do it again, and that's part of what will make the reboot so interesting, is Zach feels like the villain most of the time. There's no reason the episodes should revolve around him. Many of them, I think, would have been better. It would have been a different show, but many of the episodes would have been better if they would have spent more time with other characters and didn't have Zach as the guy, the massive presence that everything else revolved around. That's part of what came up when I was talking to Mark Paul and Daschle about Beauty and the Screech, because that's an episode where the one and only time when Kelly and Screech have chemistry together, both in terms of what they're studying for and a spark between them. And part of what is really fun about that episode is Zach is gone. We get to see different parts of their personalities and them having life and independence and just genuine joy that tends to get blocked out by Zach Morris being the first on the call sheet every time. So like that doesn't mean we don't understand why that was the nature of the show. You have to give the writers and Mark Paul Gosselaar and many people credit for the degree to which this was a show centered on Zach Morris, and it was extremely popular and successful, and people still love it, and I still have so much fondness for it. But we also see in moments like in that episode how different it was when it wasn't suggesting that the thing that mattered the most was what is the impact on this young, attractive straight white guy.
What do you think? What do you think is the greater sin, though? Because it's interesting to hear you describe, like, okay, it is centered around this guy. It kind of shouldn't be. He's sort of a villain when you look back at it. What do you think is the greater sin for a sitcom protagonist? Is it to be a Zach Morris, where you're like, wait a minute, when I think about it, this person is actually very bad, and their friends might be better off if they weren't around, or just to be purely, which I feel like is the failing of not failing, but like a flaw of many otherwise good sitcoms that seems very hard not to fall into, which is that your protagonist ends up becoming almost a milquetoast left behind element of the show, where you're like, everybody else around them is so fun and vibrant and well drawn, and they can't help but just kind of end up being, because they're the swing vote, they kind of end up being like a zero or a nothing, and we might end up by the end of the show like kind of hating them, not because they're a villain, but just because they're like kind of a nothing. Like the rest of the show has evolved more than them. They haven't been allowed to like grow.
Right. I think that's a really good question. Maybe this is slightly tangential to that, but it reminds me a little bit of The Office, of course, impacted people emotionally so much when Jim and Pam was at the center. But then, of course, after they got together and the tension of that wasn't there, I think it was probably hard for the writers to know what to do with that. And Jim Halpert was still Jim Halpert, and the actors brought a ton to those roles, but they just didn't have as much to do. I think you're right that with Zach Morris, they probably, it felt like they needed to keep going back to the well because that was the driving force of the narrative. And that's where I wonder if there had been just even a little bit more interest in pushing the growth of the characters and being willing to acknowledge things that had happened before. In the junior high episode, Zach really wants to join this group of older kids, and he's willing to do anything he can to do it, and he learns that you shouldn't sell out your friends just to join some other group of people who don't care about you and are not worth selling out your friends for. And then by the time he gets to college, granted, there's a long time in someone's life between junior high and college, but by the time he got there, they're rushing a fraternity. Viewers get the feeling like the writers don't even know that junior high episode happened. It would be so much more rewarding as a viewer if it felt like all of the characters' life experiences were accumulating, so they were learning and growing, and they wouldn't have even had to change the plot lines fully. There just could have been an awareness, so that even if it had to be spoon-fed a little out of fear that people hadn't seen the previous episode, but there still could have been a chance to feel like we were growing up with them, as I think you do with Corey and Topanga and Sean on Boy Meets World. But that just wasn't the goal with Saved by the Bell. So I think in the small snippets of the independent episodes, you could really enjoy it. You could look forward to watching it as part of your school day or your weekend or late at night in college or something. But I think if you're trying to cross-reference what it means to people and why and how the episodes make them feel compared to other shows about being a teenager, it stands on its own in a really unusual but large way.
Interesting. Like it in terms of not letting the emotions and the relationships be cumulative or things really to land on the characters and then persist in time. It almost feels like it ends up skewing a little bit younger than, say, a Boy Meets World, where, as you're describing, like the characters and situations are allowed to be somewhat cumulative. And honestly, like the characters are allowed to like grow with the audience a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I don't know. I'm not saying that it was intentional, but I think by the way that it wound up being designed, it didn't really ask you to think critically about it. It just sort of was something to enjoy in the moment and not have to wonder, hey, I thought this relationship was changing, or hey, these two people have had an on and off relationship for the last 4 years, and yet now they're both getting into relationships with other people, and there's no impact on the dynamic between the two of them. They're just that's completely edited out. It always, going back to the series, it feels like the person watching the show knows more than the characters themselves.
And there's something satisfying about that. My second to last question. So the Max, right? This is the club that they all hang out at, and that was the thing that was the pop-up?
Yes.
Is there sort of like a Riverdale, like Pop's chocolate shop element to it? Do they have like burgers and fries there? Is it that kind of a hangout, or is it literally like, do they have refreshments? And if so, did you think the food looked good like the first time around? And then when you went to the actual pop-up, did they have food? Did it live up to your expectations? What was the journey?
Well, I would say that I think the food at Pop's Chocolate Shop looks much better than the food does at the Max.
Looks so good, right?
Oh yeah, those shakes have to be delicious. I don't feel like we were ever meant to feel very much, or at least not much particularly positive about the food at the Max. It was just like the place where they always went, where so many events had to take place there for questionable reasons, and it was sort of modeled after Ed DeBevick's and had that dinery feel, with probably a not similar menu to Pop's Chocolate Shop, I would say, but I would much rather eat at Pop's. However, having eaten at Say by the Max when it was in Chicago, the food was actually really good. I have to imagine a lot of people ate there and were just expecting the burst of nostalgia and to be impressed with how much it looked like the Max on the show, which it really did. But it was satisfying as a meal as well. Of course, I'm blanking on what I had there, but I very much remember being there and being impressed with what they had put into it.
Oh, that's cool. I gotta give them credit for that, because I think of those sort of, very Instagram friendly kind of pop-up things as being like the last thing they're going to do is they might care about how the food looks, but the last thing they're going to do is care about it actually being, anything at all. So I appreciate it. Sounds like they took the time to kind of be like, you're making a whole thing of this and a whole day of this. Let's give you something that is like actually good. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to see how many different pop-ups there have been based on other shows, and bringing a lot of passion, but also like an actual great experience beyond nostalgia for people who go is great. And like I said, I interviewed the co-founder of Say by the Max and this enterprise, Derek Barry, for the book, and it was really fun to hear stories about cast members coming into the restaurant and people dressing up as characters from the show. I mean, the Say by the Bell fandom is serious. People dressing up as Artie the Chameleon, Slater's pet who died on Zach's watch. That shows that people have a strong affinity for something, I would say, to dress up as a chameleon to go out to dinner.
And it's not, just to be clear, this isn't Derek Barry from the Australian drag queen from RuPaul's Drag Race, right?
Correct. Not
okay. Gotcha. Okay. Darn it. Almost got a real pop cultural twofer there. That would have been almost too exciting. And so, Matt Pais, final question. We were talking about, again, before we turn the mics on, you were saying like home cooking, not a huge feature of literally your life, but I would love to know if there is anything in the world that you've ever eaten, maybe again, something nostalgic that you ate growing up as a kid, or that, a relative used to make, or just like the best thing you ever ate on a trip or something. If there was one thing that you could snap your fingers and know how to make perfectly, what would it be?
Wow. That's such a great question. Yeah, you're right. My wife is an incredible cook. I really like grilling, so when the weather allows for it in Chicago, I love being able to do nothing complex but burgers, chicken, sausage, corn on the cob on the
Mm.
grill, that sort of thing. Otherwise, it's delighting in making cheesy scrambled eggs in a bowl
Ooh, yum.
for my son and me. But in terms of when I was growing up, my mom would make cottage cheese pancakes. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with.
My wife's family, so I think on her dad's side, the like cottage cheese pancakes recipe is yes, is a not jealously guarded, but is a very valued family recipe. Yes, the cottage cheese pancakes are phenomenal.
That's awesome. I feel like that's something that a lot of people don't know about, but that was totally a weekend ritual that I always look forward to. So of course it's special now, the times that my mom has made that for my son. And when I have to think of if I was going to be really high minded about a memorable meal or something that it would be incredible if I could replicate. There's a dish when I went to Orvieto in Italy. Um, there was a restaurant that had a gnidi dish. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That was just mind-blowingly good. And of course, I'm sure if I tried to do a pasta dish with honey and cheese, it would be pathetically simplistic,
Ooh.
and couldn't imagine uh, getting it anywhere near that level. But that's one dish that stands out of my mind. That was just, I mean, that whole day of food there. Anytime anyone I know is planning a trip to Italy, I always give a recommendation to take a day trip to Orvieto. It's a beautiful place.
Oh man, that sounds phenomenal. Is that in the north or the south?
It's just like a 45 to an hour minute train ride outside of Rome.
Mm, that sounds fantastic. I don't even know if I've ever even heard of Needy.
Yeah, I think we had seen or heard about that particular dish at that restaurant in some kind of travel guide before we went, and a friend of mine had been to Orvieto and I think was the one who introduced me to the idea of taking that day trip. And it wasn't like it was some super fancy restaurant or insanely expensive dish or anything. It was just knowing where to go and what to have there. So because I'm definitely not much of a white tablecloth person myself. Just wanting good things. But then again, I'm also someone who, if I go out and see a breakfast burger on the menu, but that the place also has a croissant, I'll ask them, "Hey, can you put the breakfast burger on the croissant?"
Oh yes.
And then they're like, "I'll check." And they can, and it is always worth asking people to do that. As long as it's not too much of an issue. I don't want to cause any problems or make a big deal, but if they have it, you would think they'd be able to put it on, and great to come up with those ideas when possible.
Oh, absolutely, Matt. Thank you for ending this on a note of like a hack, like people can really. This is usable information for people. They can go out and really. That's fantastic. I can't wait to do that again next time that it's we're it makes sense to eat in a diner or wherever. I that's good. And don't sell yourself short. You're an innovator.
I appreciate that. I think that not being limited to the oppression of bread choices being made for you is one of the top issues we are facing today.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, and I think everybody listening would be hard pressed to argue that point. Matt, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for joining me. I feel like I again, and thank you really for just really, I feel like filling in again a part of the sort of the cultural blind spot, a sort. I feel more of a piece with much of the rest of my generation, and I think that's really important. And also, thank you for. I think it's cool. You sort of touched on it, just like it's neat to approach these things in a sort of like a critical, but a sort of like fun and fun-loving way. And even not being a fan of Saved by the Bell, when I was going through the book, it's just a very fun, consumable, neat, smart, I can't imagine anybody liking Saved by the Bell or even just remembers watching it. Maybe it's not even your favorite show, that would not like this book. So congratulations on it. Thank you for doing this. And I hope you had fun.
Thank you so much, DC. I so appreciate you having me. I so appreciate those kind words on the book. That was definitely the goal, that for someone who had never watched the show and finally wanted to see what all the fuss is about, that it could be a fun companion episode to episode and season to season with some additional insight from the interviews, or to just be a deep dive for people who know the show really well and try to be a fun celebration that pushes their understanding forward. I love what you're doing with this podcast. I'm honored to be on it with you. And thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure, man. Thank you so much. And have a great rest of your day.
Likewise.
All right, that is it. That is all for this week's episode of Stay for Dinner. Thank you so much to my guest, Matt Pais. His book, Zach Morris Lied 329 Times, is available everywhere. Please, he encourages you and I encourage you to get it from an independent bookseller. It's also available as an ebook. And while we're on the subject of books, I've written a couple of novels, The Boy Who Couldn't Sleep and Never Had To and Crap Kingdom. They are available again wherever fine books are sold. Ask your independent bookseller, support them through this absolutely insane and tough time. Support everyone, support yourself, and please, if you have a little support left over, go ahead and support this podcast by rating it and leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I really appreciate it. All of this stuff helps more people find the show, and that in turn helps there be more show. Thank you so much to Sarah Becan, author of both, or illustrator rather, and co-author of the book Let's Make Ramen. Get that again while we're plugging books. It's so good, and I'm going to be cooking from it for the next few weeks. Check it out. She also did my podcast art. Thanks to Jason Anderson, who did the intro song July 4th, 2004. Owen Ashworth, the amazing advanced bass, did my interstitial music, and I think that is all I have to say at this point. Catch more ramen, I think, next week. We'll be making chashu, the pork that goes on top, and I suspect it's going to be really delicious. Oh, you want to know something exciting? Speaking of Let's Make Ramen, I tweeted at Hugh and Sarah, and Hugh chimed in to say, yep, no worries. You can totally dilute with water, but what you have right there, you can actually just put into an ice cube tray, and it just makes like basically instant concentrated ramen for whatever you want it, which is pretty cool too. I will be diluting it, I think, but it's nice to have the option, and I appreciated him weighing in. It's a great book. Get it. I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.